Welcome to Dreamscribe, your companion on the journey to peaceful sleep. Before you drift off, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps this calming community grow. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Take a deep breath, get cozy, and let the tranquility of the moment guide you into rest. The road stretched endlessly before them, a winding ribbon of asphalt cutting through dense, towering forests. Lisa stared out the passenger window of the RV, her head resting against the cool glass. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long, shifting shadows across the highway. She felt uneasy, though she couldn't quite say why. "This is supposed to be relaxing, right?" Lisa asked, breaking the silence. Mark glanced at her, one hand on the steering wheel and the other adjusting the radio dial. "It's a road trip," he said with a grin. "How much more relaxing can it get? Just us, the open road, and this charmingly vintage RV." Lisa rolled her eyes. The RV, a bulky relic from the 1980s, had been Mark's impulsive purchase at a local auction. He'd been enamored with its retro charm and low price, ignoring the faint smell of mildew and the strange stains on the upholstery. Lisa had been less enthused, but had reluctantly gone along with the plan. After all, it was supposed to be an adventure. As Mark fiddled with the radio, static hissed through the speakers. He turned the knob, searching for a station, but the static only grew louder. "Weird," he muttered. "I thought we'd get better reception out here." Lisa glanced at the radio, her unease deepening. "Maybe it's just old, like the rest of this thing." Mark chuckled, but the sound was cut short when a faint voice crackled through the static. Lisa sat up straight, her heart skipping a beat. "Turn back," the voice whispered, barely audible. "Did you hear that?" Lisa asked, her voice tinged with alarm. Mark frowned, turning the dial again. "Hear what?" Lisa leaned closer to the radio. The static hissed, broken by fragments of distorted speech. It was faint, like someone speaking from far away, but the words were unmistakable. "Leave now." "It's not safe." Mark's brow furrowed. "It's probably just a prank or interference. CB radios can do weird stuff." Lisa wasn't convinced. She crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on the radio. It sounded specific. Mark shrugged, forcing a grin. "Come on, it's nothing. Let's just focus on finding a good spot to park for the night." Lisa nodded reluctantly, but the feeling of unease lingered. As twilight descended, they found a secluded campsite nestled among the trees. It was picturesque, the kind of place they'd imagined when planning the trip. Mark parked the RV in a clearing, the crunch of gravel under the tires breaking the forest's quiet. "This is perfect," Mark said, stepping out and stretching. "No crowds, no noise. Just us and nature." Lisa stepped out hesitantly, scanning the surrounding woods. The towering pines swayed gently in the evening breeze, their dark silhouettes blending into the encroaching shadows. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "You okay?" Mark asked, noticing her hesitation. "Yeah," Lisa said quickly. "Just tired, I guess." After dinner, they settled into the RV's small living area. Mark pulled out a deck of cards, eager to pass the time with a few rounds of poker. Lisa played along, though her mind kept drifting back to the radio. "Your turn," Mark said, nudging her. Lisa nodded absently, glancing toward the dashboard. The radio, though turned off, emitted a faint crackle. She froze, her heart pounding. "Mark, do you hear that?" "Hear what?" he asked, following her gaze. The crackle grew louder, and then, without warning, the radio switched on. Static filled the cabin, and the lights on the dashboard flickered. Lisa and Mark exchanged a nervous glance. "Okay, that's creepy," Mark admitted. He walked over to the dashboard and turned the radio off, twisting the knob firmly. For a moment, the RV was silent. Then the static returned, louder than before. The radio powered on by itself, and a voice broke through the noise. "You shouldn't be here." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. "Mark, what is this?" Mark forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "It's probably a short circuit or something. This thing is old. Wires get crossed, electronics act up. I'll take a look at it in the morning." Lisa wasn't convinced. "It doesn't sound like a short circuit," she said. "It sounds like someone's trying to warn us." Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's nothing, Lisa. Don't let it get to you. We'll fix it." Reluctantly, Lisa nodded. But as they prepared for bed, the uneasy feeling in her chest only grew stronger. Lisa lay awake in the RV's narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Mark was already asleep beside her, his breathing slow and steady. The radio crackled again, faint but insistent. Lisa sat up, her heart racing. She strained to hear, her ears picking up the faint sound of a voice beneath the static. "You have to leave." She shook Mark awake. "Mark, it's happening again." Mark groaned, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Lisa, it's the middle of the night. Just ignore it." "I can't ignore it," she snapped. "It's not normal." The radio grew louder, the static nearly deafening. Mark climbed out of bed, frustration etched on his face. He marched to the dashboard, yanking the power cord from the radio. "There," he said. "It's off." But the static continued, undeterred. The voice returned, clearer this time. "It's inside with you." Lisa and Mark stared at the radio, their fear palpable. "What does it mean?" Lisa whispered. "What's inside with us?" Mark shook his head, his bravado crumbling. "I don't know, but we're leaving. First thing in the morning." Lisa nodded, though she wasn't sure morning would come. She could feel it now, a presence in the RV, unseen but undeniable. The air felt heavier, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. As the static faded, Lisa lay back down, clutching Mark's hand tightly. Neither of them slept, their ears attuned to every creak and groan of the RV. The introduction for radio static sets a chilling tone, establishing the couple, the eerie setting, and the unexplained phenomena that escalate the suspense. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments, or to continue with the next section. The morning came slowly, with pale light filtering through the dense canopy of trees that surrounded the secluded campsite. Lisa stepped out of the RV, wrapping her arms around herself as the crisp air bit at her skin. The forest was eerily still, the only sound a faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Mark joined her, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's quiet," he said, his voice low. "Too quiet." Lisa nodded, her eyes scanning the tree line. The campsite, which had seemed serene and picturesque the day before, now felt oppressive. The trees were tall and ancient, their gnarled branches intertwining above them to form a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. Shadows stretched long across the ground, their shapes shifting subtly as the wind moved the branches. "I don't like this place," Lisa said. "It feels wrong." Mark tried to smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll pack up and leave after breakfast," he said. "No point in sticking around if it's giving you the creeps." Back inside the RV, Lisa couldn't shake her unease. The small space, once a cozy haven, now felt confining. The faint smell of mildew lingered, mixing with the aroma of the coffee Mark had brewed. She glanced around, noticing details she hadn't paid attention to before. The way the upholstery seemed darker in some spots, as though stained by something long ago. The faint scratches on the walls near the kitchenette, almost like claw marks. The radio sitting dark and silent, its knobs gleaming faintly in the weak light. She moved closer to the radio, her fingers hesitating over the dial. Mark, catching her movement, shook his head. "Don't," he said firmly. "Just leave it alone." Lisa backed away, her stomach twisting. "It's like it's watching us," she whispered. Mark sighed, trying to hide his own unease. "It's just a machine," he said, though his tone betrayed his doubt. "Nothing more." After breakfast, they decided to take a walk through the woods. Lisa hoped the fresh air would clear her mind, but as they ventured deeper, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no distant hum of insects. Only the crunch of their boots on the forest floor and the occasional creak of branches overhead. The stillness pressed against them, making every sound seem amplified. "Do you hear that?" Lisa asked suddenly, stopping in her tracks. Mark turned to her, frowning. "Hear what?" Lisa tilted her head, straining to listen. There was again a faint, static-like hum, coming from somewhere in the distance. It was so soft she almost thought she was imagining it. "It's nothing," Mark said, though his eyes darted nervously around the trees. "Let's keep moving." As they continued, they stumbled upon a small, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. Its roof sagged, and the wood was dark with rot. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine as she approached it, the hum growing slightly louder. "Mark, let's go back," she said, her voice trembling. Mark hesitated, but shook his head. "It's probably just an old hunting cabin," he said. "No harm in taking a quick look." Inside, the cabin was empty save for a few rusted tools and a broken chair. The air was thick and musty, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. On the far wall, someone had scratched words into the wood. "IT knows." Lisa backed away, her heart racing. "We shouldn't be here," she said. Mark nodded, his bravado fading. "Yeah, let's get out of here." When they returned to the campsite, the RV looked different. The curtains, which they had left open, were now drawn shut. Lisa stopped in her tracks, staring at it. "Did you close the curtains?" she asked. Mark shook his head. "No. Did you?" Lisa's stomach churned. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes scanning the RV's exterior. Everything else seemed untouched, but the closed curtains gave it an ominous air, as though something or someone was inside. Mark tried the door, and it swung open easily. The interior was just as they had left it, but the air felt heavier. The faint smell of burning wires lingered, and Lisa noticed that the radio's power light was on, even though it was still unplugged. "This isn't normal," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't respond. He walked over to the radio, staring at it for a long moment before finally reaching out and turning the dial. Static hissed through the speakers, louder than before. Mark quickly turned it off, but the static persisted, filling the cabin with its grating sound. Lisa backed away, her heart pounding. "It doesn't make sense," she said. "It's not even plugged in." Mark stood frozen, staring at the radio. "Maybe it's a battery backup," he said weakly, though they both knew the excuse didn't hold up. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker, the shadows deepening. Inside the RV, Lisa and Mark sat in tense silence, the radio still emitting faint static despite their attempts to silence it. Lisa flipped through the pages of an old travel guide they had brought, trying to distract herself. But her eyes kept drifting to the radio. Every so often, the static would break, and a faint voice would emerge, speaking words she couldn't quite make out. "Mark, we should leave," she said finally. "I don't care if it's the middle of the night. I don't want to stay here." Mark nodded, his own unease finally overtaking his skepticism. "First light," he said. "We'll leave as soon as there's enough light to see the road." But as the hours passed, Lisa began to wonder if they would make it to morning. This section sets the scene with a creeping, oppressive atmosphere, focusing on unsettling details and an escalating sense of dread. The RV and its surroundings become characters in their own right, building tension for the horror to come. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments or to move to the next section. The night closed in around the RV like a shroud, the dense forest swallowing all light save for the faint glow of the dashboard. Inside, Lisa and Mark sat in silence, the oppressive weight of the evening pressing down on them. The static from the radio was softer now, almost imperceptible, but its presence was a constant reminder that something was very wrong. Lisa sat at the small table, flipping through the travel guide she'd been trying to read earlier. The words blurred together, her mind unable to focus. Every creak of the RV, every groan of the wind outside made her jump. Mark sat by the radio, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the device as if he could will it to stay silent. "We should have left earlier," Lisa said, breaking the tense silence. Mark didn't respond. His hand hovered over the radio's power knob, his fingers twitching slightly. He glanced at Lisa, his face pale. "I don't think it matters anymore." Lisa frowned. "What do you mean?" Mark hesitated, then gestured to the radio. "It's not just the radio," he said. "It's the RV. The whole thing feels wrong." The soft static grew louder, the sound filling the cabin like a physical presence. Lisa flinched, her eyes darting to the radio. "Turn it off," she said, her voice trembling. "I did," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned the knob again, but the static didn't waver. The radio wasn't plugged in, yet it hummed with energy, the sound distorting into faint whispers. Lisa stood, her breath shallow. "What's it saying?" Mark leaned closer, straining to hear. The whispers were faint, broken by bursts of static, but he caught fragments. "Not safe, must leave, too late." Mark's stomach churned. "It's warning us," he said. "But it's already too late." A soft thud echoed through the RV. Lisa spun around, her heart racing. "What was that?" she asked. Mark shook his head, rising slowly from his seat. He scanned the small space, his eyes narrowing. The sound came again, louder this time, a dull, rhythmic thumping coming from the back of the RV. "Stay here," Mark said, grabbing a flashlight. He moved cautiously toward the rear of the vehicle, the beam of light cutting through the shadows. Lisa stayed rooted to the spot, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She watched as Mark disappeared into the narrow hallway, the flashlight casting eerie shapes on the walls. "What do you see?" she called, her voice shaking. "Nothing yet," Mark replied. But as he reached the bedroom, the thumping stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, without warning, the flashlight flickered and went out. "Mark?" Lisa called, panic rising in her chest. The flashlight blinked back on, and Mark stumbled out of the hallway, his face pale. "There's nothing there," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Lisa pointed to the table. "Then explain that," she said. Mark followed her gaze. The salt and pepper shakers, which had been on the counter, now sat neatly in the center of the table. Beside them was the travel guide Lisa had been reading, open to a page she hadn't reached yet. The words on the page had been underlined in red ink. "You're not alone." The temperature in the RV dropped suddenly, the air turning icy. Lisa's breath fogged in front of her, and she shivered. "Mark, we need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "No." Mark nodded, grabbing the keys. But as he reached for the door, a loud bang shook the RV, the entire vehicle rocking on its wheels. "Did something hit us?" Lisa asked, clutching the edge of the table to steady herself. Mark opened the door cautiously, stepping outside with a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the empty campsite. But as he swept the light across the clearing, he froze. "Lisa," he said, his voice shaking. "Come here." Lisa joined him, her heart pounding. Mark pointed to the ground in front of the RV. Deep gouges had been carved into the dirt, forming a jagged, looping pattern that made her stomach churn. "What is that?" she whispered. Before Mark could answer, the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move. Dark shapes, barely distinguishable from the surrounding trees, crept closer, their movements erratic and jerky. The air filled with a low hum, a sound that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. "Get back inside," Mark shouted, grabbing Lisa's arm. As soon as they were back inside, the RV's engine roared to life on its own. The dashboard lights flickered, and the radio blared, the static giving way to a voice, clear, sharp, and commanding. "You cannot leave." Lisa covered her ears, the sound piercing and relentless. "Make it stop," she screamed. Mark grabbed the radio, yanking it from its mount. Sparks flew as he ripped it free, tossing it to the floor. The voice stopped, but the static persisted, now coming from the speakers embedded in the ceiling. "It's everywhere," Mark said, his voice shaking. "We can't escape it." Lisa grabbed the travel guide from the table, flipping back to the underlined page. "What if it's trying to tell us something?" she said. "What if it's not just warning us, it's giving us a way out?" Mark shook his head. "That thing doesn't want to help us," he said. "It wants to trap us." The RV shook violently, the lights flickering as the shadows outside pressed against the windows. Lisa pointed to the guide. "We don't have a choice. We need to follow the signs." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Okay," he said. "What does it say?" Lisa scanned the page, her eyes landing on a single line of text. "To escape, you must confront the source." The RV's engine revved, and the vehicle began to move on its own, careening down the dark road. Lisa and Mark held on as the RV twisted and turned, the shadows outside keeping pace. The radio crackled again, the voice returning. "Closer, closer." Mark gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the wheel even though the RV wasn't responding to him. "What does it mean?" "Closer to what?" Lisa stared at the radio, her mind racing. "The source," she said. "It's taking us to the source." The RV veered sharply, pulling onto an overgrown dirt path. The trees closed in around them, their branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle like clawed hands. Ahead, a faint glow appeared, growing brighter as the RV approached. Lisa and Mark exchanged a terrified glance. Whatever was waiting for them at the end of the path, they knew it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The RV's headlights pierced the dense forest, illuminating the narrow dirt path as the vehicle barreled forward, seemingly of its own volition. Lisa clung to the armrest, her knuckles white, while Mark gripped the wheel tightly, his attempts to steer futile. "It's not me," Mark said, his voice strained. "The RV's driving itself." Lisa glanced at the glowing dashboard. The radio crackled with bursts of static, interspersed with faint whispers. Her heart pounded as she strained to make out the words. "You're close, closer." "Closer to what?" Lisa shouted, her voice breaking. But the radio offered no answers, only the ominous hum that had haunted them since the night began. The RV lurched suddenly, swerving off the dirt path and into a clearing. The headlights illuminated a decrepit structure, an old, abandoned radio tower, its rusted frame reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, the static from the radio growing louder as the vehicle came to an abrupt stop. Lisa and Mark exchanged a terrified glance. "This is it," Lisa whispered. "This is where it wants us to go." As they stepped out of the RV, the air grew colder, each breath forming clouds of mist. The ground beneath their feet was damp and soft, as though the earth itself recoiled from the tower's presence. The structure loomed above them, its jagged edges silhouetted against the dark sky. "This place, it feels wrong," Mark said, his voice barely audible. "Like it's alive." Lisa clutched the journal they had found earlier in the RV, a relic left behind by a previous owner. She flipped through its pages, her fingers trembling. One entry caught her eye, scrawled in frantic handwriting. The tower is the key. It speaks through the radio. It watches. It waits. What does that mean? Mark asked, peering over her shoulder. Lisa shook her head, her stomach churning. I don't know, but I think we're about to find out. The tower's door hung ajar, creaking softly as Mark pushed it open. The interior was dark, save for the faint glow of flickering monitors lining the walls. The static from the radio grew louder, reverberating through the space like a living thing. Lisa hesitated at the threshold, a deep sense of dread rooting her in place. Come on, Mark said, holding out a hand. We have to keep moving. Lisa nodded reluctantly, stepping inside. The air was thick and oppressive, carrying a metallic tang that made her skin crawl. As they ventured deeper, they noticed strange markings etched into the walls, symbols and phrases in a language neither of them recognized. What is this place? Lisa whispered, running her fingers over the carvings. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly under her touch, as though alive. Mark shone his flashlight on a rusted console at the center of the room. The controls were covered in dust, but a single switch glowed faintly, its light pulsating in time with the static from the radio. This has to be it, Mark said. The source. As Mark reached for the switch, the static shifted, transforming into a deep, guttural voice that filled the room. You've come, at last. Lisa gasped, stepping back as the shadows in the room began to shift and coalesce. A dark, humanoid figure emerged from the corner, its form flickering like static on a broken television. Its eyes glowed faintly, fixing on the couple with an intensity that made Lisa's knees weak. What do you want from us? Mark demanded, his voice shaking. The entity tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural. You brought me here, it said, its voice reverberating through the room. Your fear, your despair, it feeds me. Lisa clutched the journal tightly, her mind racing. The tower, she whispered. It's not just the source, it's a beacon. It's how the entity came through. Mark's eyes widened. So we shut it down, he said. We cut off its connection. The entity let out a guttural laugh, its form flickering violently. You think you can stop me? I am bound to this place, to you. You're already mine. The monitors around the room burst to life, displaying distorted images of Lisa and Mark inside the RV. Their terrified faces captured from angles they hadn't realized were possible. Lisa's stomach turned as she realized the RV had been watching them all along. Mark lunged for the glowing switch, but the entity moved faster, its shadowy form wrapping around him and throwing him across the room. He hit the wall with a grunt, the flashlight clattering to the floor. Mark? Lisa screamed, rushing to his side. The entity loomed over them, its voice a low growl. There is no escape. Lisa's eyes darted to the console. The journal's final page had mentioned a failsafe, an emergency shutdown for the tower. She spotted a lever labeled override and bolted for it, her heart pounding. The entity screeched, its form twisting and contorting as it tried to block her path. Shadows clawed at her legs, pulling her back, but she pushed forward, her fingers brushing the lever. With a final surge of strength, Lisa yanked the lever down. The tower shuddered violently, sparks flying from the consoles as the monitors blinked out one by one. The entity let out a deafening scream, its form dissolving into a swirl of static and shadows. Mark crawled to Lisa's side, his breaths ragged. Did it work? He asked, his voice barely audible. The static faded, leaving the tower in eerie silence. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifting for the first time. Lisa nodded, tears streaming down her face. I think so, she said. I think it's gone. The couple stumbled out of the tower, their legs weak and their hearts heavy. The RV sat waiting for them in the clearing, its headlights dim but steady. Lisa hesitated at the door, her hand resting on the handle. Do we go back in? She asked, her voice trembling. Mark glanced at the RV, then back at the tower. Do we have a choice? Lisa nodded, and they climbed inside. The radio was silent, its power light dark. For the first time, the RV felt normal. But as they drove away, neither could shake the feeling that something had followed them. Hours later, as dawn broke over the horizon, Lisa leaned back in her seat, exhaustion overtaking her. Mark drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road. The forest gave way to open fields, the sunlight bathing the RV in warmth. But as Lisa glanced at the dashboard, her blood ran cold. The radio's power light flickered once, then glowed steadily. A single message appeared on the display. It's not over. The RV tore through the winding forest road, its headlights casting wild shadows against the trees. Inside, Lisa and Mark braced themselves as the vehicle swerved sharply, veering toward the decrepit radio tower they thought they had left behind. The dashboard lights blinked erratically, and the radio's static-filled voice crackled through the cabin. "You cannot run. You cannot hide." Mark slammed his foot on the brake, but the RV ignored his commands, its engine roaring as it pushed forward of its own volition. "It's not stopping," he shouted, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled intensity. "Lisa, do something." Lisa scrambled to the dashboard, yanking at wires in a desperate attempt to silence the radio. Sparks flew, but the static persisted, rising to an ear-piercing crescendo. "It's like it's alive," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "We're not in control anymore." The RV skidded into the clearing, coming to a sudden, jarring halt in front of the tower. The old structure loomed above them, its rusted metal frame vibrating with an unnatural hum. The air was thick with an electric charge, making Lisa's skin prickle. The static from the radio transformed into a guttural laugh. "You thought you could escape," the voice taunted. "You belong to me now." Mark grabbed a crowbar from beneath the seat and flung open the RV's door. "We're ending this," he said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "We destroy the tower. We destroy whatever this thing is." Lisa hesitated, clutching the journal she had found earlier. The frantic scrawls of its previous owner played in her mind. The tower is the heart. The radio is its voice. Silence the voice, and the heart will fall. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's do it." As they stepped out of the RV, the shadows surged forward, their forms twisting and flickering like static. Their glowing eyes pierced the darkness, locking onto the couple with predatory intent. The low hum in the air grew louder, resonating deep in their chests. Mark swung the crowbar wildly, the metal passing through the nearest shadow without resistance. The figure let out a distorted shriek, recoiling slightly before reforming. "They're not real," he yelled. "They're projections, distractions." Lisa opened the journal, frantically searching for answers. Her fingers landed on a passage scrawled in bold. "They fear light. Use it to push through." "Mark," she shouted. "We need light." Mark looked around, spotting a flare gun mounted near the RV's door. He grabbed it, loading a cartridge and firing into the shadows. The red glow illuminated the clearing, and the figures recoiled, their forms flickering violently. "Go!" Mark yelled, grabbing Lisa's hand and pulling her toward the tower. The shadows screamed as they retreated, but the couple knew they wouldn't stay back for long. The interior of the tower was a labyrinth of rusted stairs and flickering monitors. The hum was deafening now, reverberating through the metal walls. The radio's voice followed them inside, taunting them with every step. "You can't stop me. This is my domain." Lisa clutched the journal, her eyes scanning its pages as they ascended. "There has to be a way to shut this down," she said. "Something we're missing." Mark pushed open a heavy door at the top of the stairs, revealing the tower's control room. In the center of the room was a massive console, its panels glowing with an unnatural light. Wires snaked across the floor, pulsating like veins. "This is it," Mark said, his voice low. "The heart of it all." As they approached the console, the shadows materialized in the room, surrounding them. The radio's voice boomed, shaking the walls. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand. You are nothing but noise." Mark raised the crowbar, ready to defend Lisa as she studied the console. Her eyes landed on a large lever-marked manual override. She pointed to it. "That's it. If we pull that, it should shut everything down." Mark nodded, but as he stepped toward the lever, the shadows lunged. One wrapped around his arm, its icy tendrils seeping into his skin. He screamed, dropping the crowbar as he fell to his knees. "Mark!" Lisa cried, rushing to his side. She grabbed the crowbar, swinging it wildly at the shadow. It recoiled, giving Mark enough time to crawl toward the lever. The voice grew louder, its tone desperate. "If you do this, you'll lose everything." Mark ignored it, gripping the lever with both hands. "Lisa, get ready to run," he shouted, pulling with all his strength. The tower shuddered violently as the override engaged. Sparks flew from the console, and the monitors exploded in a cascade of glass and light. The shadows let out a collective scream, their forms disintegrating into smoke. Lisa grabbed Mark, pulling him toward the stairs as the tower began to collapse. The walls groaned, and chunks of metal fell around them, the hum growing louder and more erratic. "We're not going to make it," Lisa shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "Yes, we will," Mark yelled back, grabbing her hand. They sprinted down the stairs, dodging falling debris as the tower crumbled behind them. The couple burst out of the tower just as it collapsed in on itself, a massive plume of dust and light erupting into the sky. The radio's voice let out one final, distorted scream before falling silent. Lisa and Mark stumbled back to the RV, collapsing inside. They sat in stunned silence, their breaths ragged, as the dust settled outside. "Did we do it?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, though uncertainty lingered in his eyes. "I think so. It's over." But as he turned the key in the ignition, the radio crackled to life one last time. A faint, chilling whisper filled the cabin. For now. The early morning light bathed the clearing in a pale, golden glow as the dust settled from the tower's collapse. Lisa and Mark sat in the RV, their breaths shallow, the events of the night etched into their pale faces. The oppressive hum that had haunted them was gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. Lisa stared out the window, her hands trembling as she gripped the journal. "It's over," she whispered, her voice wavering. "We did it." Mark glanced at her, his exhaustion evident. "Did we?" he asked. His gaze shifted to the remains of the tower, now a pile of twisted metal and shattered glass. What if it's not really gone? Lisa opened the journal to the last page, her eyes scanning the scrawled words. The heart can be silenced, but its echo remains. A chill ran down her spine. "What if it's still lingering?" she murmured. Mark turned the key in the ignition, and the RV sputtered to life. The radio remained silent, its power light dark, but Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. As they pulled onto the road, the trees seemed taller, their shadows stretching unnaturally long across the highway. The drive was eerily quiet, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the RV's frame. Lisa sat with the journal in her lap, flipping through its pages. The ink had faded in places, as though the events at the tower had drained some of its essence. "Do you think it's really over?" Lisa asked, breaking the silence. Mark hesitated, gripping the wheel tighter. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we're alive. That has to count for something." Lisa nodded, though her unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that the entity wasn't truly gone, that it was still with them, hiding in the corners of the RV waiting. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Lisa began to notice subtle changes in the RV. The faint smell of burning wires lingered, and the crack in the dashboard had deepened, forming a jagged line that seemed to pulse faintly in the sunlight. "Mark, does the dashboard look different to you?" she asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. Mark glanced down, frowning. "It's just wear and tear," he said. "This thing's old. You're overthinking it." But Lisa wasn't convinced. She reached out to touch the crack, and a sharp jolt shot up her arm. She yanked her hand back, her heart racing. "Mark, something's wrong," she said. "It's not over." Mark pulled the RV to the side of the road, his expression grim. "Let's check it out," he said. He grabbed a flashlight and opened the hood, peering into the engine compartment. "What do you see?" Lisa asked, standing beside him. Mark's face paled. "It doesn't make sense," he said. "The wires, they're moving." Lisa leaned closer, her stomach churning. The wires inside the engine pulsed faintly, like veins, their movements almost imperceptible. "It's still alive," she whispered. "The RV, it's still connected to the entity." Lisa opened the journal again, searching for answers. Her eyes landed on a passage she hadn't noticed before. The heart's echo can only be silenced with fire. Only total destruction ensures freedom. "Fire," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to burn it. The whole RV." Mark stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious? This is all we have left. If we don't, it'll never stop," Lisa said. "It'll keep coming back. It'll take us, just like it took the others." Mark's shoulders sagged as he considered her words. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it." They drove the RV to an open field, far from the forest and any sign of civilization. The air was still, the weight of their decision pressing heavily on them. Mark retrieved a can of gasoline from the storage compartment, while Lisa gathered their belongings. As they worked, Lisa found herself looking around the RV, memories flooding her mind. The cramped kitchen where they'd shared meals, the tiny bed where they'd whispered dreams of their future. It was all about to be gone. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked, his voice soft. Lisa nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We don't have a choice," she said. "It's the only way to be free." Mark poured the gasoline over the interior, the pungent smell filling the air. Lisa struck a match, her hand trembling. She hesitated for a moment, then dropped it onto the soaked floor. The flames roared to life, consuming the RV in seconds. Lisa and Mark stood back, watching as the fire engulfed the vehicle. The heat was intense, the crackling of the flames drowning out everything else. As the fire reached the engine, a piercing scream erupted from the RV, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Lisa covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. The scream faded into a low hum, then silence. The RV collapsed in on itself, reduced to a smoldering pile of ash and twisted metal. The oppressive feeling that had haunted them lifted, replaced by an almost eerie calm. "It's over," Mark said, his voice barely audible. "It's really over." Lisa nodded, though a part of her wasn't entirely convinced. She clutched the journal tightly, its pages now completely blank. Days later, Lisa and Mark checked into a small motel, hoping to put as much distance between themselves and the events as possible. They tried to resume a semblance of normalcy, but the memories lingered, haunting their every thought. One night, as Lisa sat alone in the motel room, the television flickered, static filling the screen. Her heart stopped as a faint voice emerged from the noise. "You thought you could escape?" She backed away, her hands trembling. The voice grew louder, the static morphing into distorted laughter. The motel lights flickered, and the smell of burning wires filled the room. "Mark," she screamed, but he didn't answer. The screen went dark, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then, the radio on the nightstand crackled to life, its power light glowing faintly. Lisa stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. The voice returned, a chilling whisper that made her blood run cold. "It's not over." The resolution concludes radio static with an unsettling mix of closure and lingering dread, leaving viewers with a haunting final twist that ensures the story stays with them long after it ends. Let me know if further adjustments are needed.